Thanks, Jared, and I'm excited to be here. I'm one of those people who have been here for the last 4 years. So this conference is always one of the highlights of the spring for me, and the talk I'm going to give today is actually really specially tied into this New York City R conference, because I'm going to be talking about my experience working in healthcare technology and accelerating cancer research using R, and in particular I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that, that we've faced at the company I work for, Flatiron Health, over the last few years, both as a smaller startup, which was a talk I gave on this very stage 2 years ago. I talked about the first year and some of the challenges we encountered using R. And so today, I'm going to refresh some of that material that I presented 2 years ago, and then tell you what has happened in the last 2 years and what the next set of challenges we face are. And so, a little bit about me and my background. So I come from a world of academic biostatistics, and first in graduate school and then as a faculty member at Cleveland Clinic. And so some of the work that I did there was really focused on using R. I was working pretty independently, so I could use whatever language I wanted for the most part. A few times in grad school I used SAS under duress. But mostly I used R, and I was coding by myself. You know, for better or for worse, a lot of academics are working pretty independently, so no one was really reviewing my code. I didn't have to follow any standards. I just wanted to get the research right. And so after doing that for a few years, as Jared mentioned, he convinced me to move to New York from Cleveland, and I joined a healthcare tech company called Flatiron Health here because I was interested in a faster pace and a potential for more immediate impact to my work. And so once I got to Flatiron, things changed in terms of the technical environment I was in. It wasn't just I use whatever I wanted to get the job done. Now I'm in this environment that is a tech company, so there are many software engineers using Python. All of the data lived in relational databases, so we used variants of SQL. Some of my coworkers at the time used SAS too. I obviously wanted to use R, but it wasn't really as clear-cut of a decision as it was in the past. So before I get into how we made some of these decisions over time, just want to tell you a little bit about what we do at the company to give some context. So our mission is to improve lives by learning from the experience of every cancer patient. So you might ask, well, every cancer patient, we're not doing that already? And the answer is no. So right now, about only 5% or so of cancer patients are enrolled in clinical trials. The other, about 95%, are going to their oncologist. They're getting some kinds of treatment, and some of them are getting better, and some of them are getting worse. And unfortunately, a lot of that information isn't really getting used for research. So it's being captured in an electronic health record, but the format that it's being captured and being siloed in different locations and not being standardized is just not necessarily research-grade data. So right now, for the most part, we're not learning from the experience of that 95% of cancer patients. And so that's what I've been working on the last few years, as well as my coworkers, trying to process some of this oncology-based EHR data at scale. And so how do we do that? We don't look at the structured data. So those are discrete fields that actually have standardized data inputs, things like demographics and diagnoses and labs. But yet, they still need to be standardized and harmonized. They're messy and complex on their own in their raw form. We also take unstructured data. So those are things that live in things like physician notes, radiology reports, free text. It could be in a scanned document that's scanned at 45 degrees and handwritten and has things crossed out. And often there's very clinically complex information in there. So what we actually do is we use a combination of technology and clinically trained human abstractors to do that. And so we use technology in the form of both software we develop and then models and algorithms that we use to surface exactly the right information to the right people to then extract that information in the clinical context. And so once we process all of this data and standardize it, we then have a combined analytic data set of research-grade data that we can then use to answer some of these questions. And so flashback 2 years to me on the stage, giving this talk about my experience from 2015 when I joined, when it was still a smaller startup. That year we had about 100 to 150 people. Most of them, or at least a vast majority, were software engineers. The quantitative sciences team that I was on had one person when I started. And then when I came and gave this talk, so it's on YouTube, I called it A Statistician Walks into a Tech Company, because I started this job and I was like, where did I end up? Who am I? How did I get here? How do I work in this environment? And so that was the talk I gave 2 years ago about that experience. And so over that year, we scaled from about 100 to about 250 or more. And so over doubled in size in that 1 year. And the quantitative sciences team did grow from 1 to 10 over the course of that year. But as I mentioned, the choice of what language to use was not clear-cut. So the team coming in at the time actually was predominantly SAS users in that first year. And so, I was coming from an R background, and that's really what I wanted to use, but it's just not a clear-cut answer of what the best choice is here. And so people did have some experience with R, but this is their self-rated proficiency at time of hire for that first year's team. And so some of them had no experience, but a lot were beginners. So maybe they had seen it, used it a little bit, perhaps like a lot of people in this room today who are just getting into R. And so early on, some of the challenges that we faced in that first year were the basic things of actually just which language do we use? And this is an actual list of pros and cons that my colleague Melissa came up with one late night we were trying to decide. And she wrote down all the reasons to use SAS and all the reasons to use R. And some of them were very practical and some of them were more fun. So for SAS, it made sense because we collaborated with pharma companies as a healthcare tech company. And although many of them do use R, there was still at least a conception that a lot of them use SAS. We had also paid money for a license, and so we didn't want to waste all that money. And for her and others in the team, it was intuitive. They had experience with it. It felt familiar. Then on the R side, there were things like the community around R. We thought it aligned with our values as a company. We thought it was the future. We also thought it worked really well with our tools that we used, like Max and Git for version control. And then my favorite reason she had was that the sweatshirts and the swag were much better for R. And so she really liked the sweatshirt, and then that night we made the decision. Because in a small company, you can just make a decision like this, 2 people one night, and then we were going to use R. So great, decided. Then we had to figure out how to cultivate R culture. And we started things like starting an internal R package. It was really not much to speak of at all in the beginning, but at least it was a beginning. We also started a user group where we would share information and knowledge. If you work in a tech company, you'll know you need a Slack channel to do anything, so we started a Slack channel for R. We started having trainings and doing targeted hiring. If anybody is in this stage, I would really recommend there's a blog post from the Airbnb data science team about using R packages in education to scale data science. And a lot of these things that we used in that first year are really covered very well in that blog post. So did these things in that first year work? Well, if you go from the time of hire to 2016, when I gave that last talk here, there was a big change in terms of self-rated proficiency. So people on the team were starting to call themselves intermediate and advanced users. Everybody had started using R, which was really a big success. And then, so enter the next phase. And this is what's really happened in the last 2 years since I was here. So now we have a very different team and a very different size. So now the company has moved from 250 then to over 500 now. And the composition of the team now, actually their primary language at time of hire was very different. So now most people coming into the team were using R before they joined. And they were not beginners or with no experience. There were a lot of advanced and expert users. In fact, actually, one of the original data points when I did this survey a few months ago, it said, well, I thought I was an expert before I joined, and then I recalibrated and realized I wasn't as good as I thought. So I actually imputed that as advanced, but don't ever tell anyone I did single imputation here, please. And so in that phase, over the last 2 years, we've done a lot of the same things that we had done earlier, but going to the next stage. So we've, instead of just starting this internal R package, we've grown it and added a lot of functionality and really tried to cultivate a user group And of course, one Slack channel is not enough, so we need multiple Slack channels. We've started to think about standardization and having standards for some of the things that we do quite often, as well as thinking about quality control and unit tests, and with an emphasis on reproducibility. So the work that we've done has changed a lot since the beginning. So early on, we were doing, like a small startup, we do imagine, a lot of rapid prototyping, a lot of quick analyses. In these last 2 years, actually a lot of our work has gone towards things like publications or collaborations with organizations like the FDA. And so when we think about those things, a quick prototype probably isn't enough. We really need to change the way that we're doing things. And part of the way that we've done that is having kind of an agreed upon shared set of packages that help us move quickly. And so you'll recognize a lot of these here. This is just a small sample. No coincidence, a lot of them are from the Tidyverse. And these help with both readability and standardization and are just much better tools to allow us to move quickly. I'll come back to this in a little while, though, when we talk about the trade-offs of actually having a standard set of packages and why that's not always agreed upon. The other package that we've been using to help us move quickly is our internal package, Flatiron R. And so that's the one that we created internally for a lot of functions for things like database connections that we use here and a lot of functionality that we use often. And of course, it has its own hex sticker because if you really want something to be successful, that's the best way to get the message out there. And so some more about that internal package. So it's things that have functions that are specific to the specific data format that we have, database connections, standardizing those across all of our databases. So it's not the most exciting or sexy type of functions there, but they're really useful functions that help us move faster. So we also have things like, for example, we work in oncology, so we do a lot of survival analyses. And we have some Kaplan-Meier curve functions that do them in a specific and standardized way that match our specifications. And actually, my colleague Josh is in the audience and was really helpful in getting some of those off the ground. So another thing, if anybody has worked in kind of the biomedical research world, you'll know the joys and frustrations of making a table 1, which is basically a table of baseline characteristics of patients. And so there's nothing too fancy here. It's really looking at just descriptive statistics about the patients. But you often have to do it in a very specialized format and comparing the groups. And so it's just really nice to have different kinds of helper functions to do that. And so there's this really nice package called compare groups that we use quite a bit. And that allows us to more easily do things that are specific for this kind of medical research environment. And so I mentioned early on that we had some, starting to do some work in collaborations with companies or with organizations like the FDA. And so early on, we had thought actually one of the reasons to use SAS was there was this misconception out there that the FDA only looked at SAS and that they were against R. And they had never actually said that, but that's what people really thought. And so one of the big pieces of pushback we got early on was, oh, you can't use R if you ever want to do anything related to the FDA. Well, fast forward 2 years now, and earlier this year we had our first joint collaborative publication with them come out, and all of the analyses we did in R. And it turns out it's really not a big deal at all, and as long as we're using the right reproducible standards, it hasn't been a problem. And a little bit more about this paper, I think, because it's really interesting. So this was actually looking at characteristics of real-world patients. So those are those 95% of patients that are seeing their oncologist, but not in a clinical trial. And this is in the setting of advanced non-small cell lung cancer. And so looking at those real-world lung cancer patients compared to patients in a clinical trial. And one of the things that we found in this collaboration is that those are very different types of patients. So it's not just that patients aren't being included in this research, but they're actually very different in all of these different ways in patient characteristics. And so what we think is that the studies of outcomes in these underrepresented populations through real-world data are actually essential for informing real-world treatment decisions. It came out in January, but I'm happy to give you the reference later. So Now in 2018, after this 2-year phase, this was the beginning of the year, I resurveyed the team, and proficiency with R is now very high. Almost everybody rates themselves at advanced or higher, or intermediate. And so I'm not going to necessarily assume any causality here in terms of what we did and what happened, but I do think that a lot of the things that we've worked on over time have really helped with this. So are we done? Have we, succeeded? Is this no more challenges? Well, I have to tell you no. Although we have come so far, there are still challenges that remain, and next level success looks different than what we've done in the past. So early on, success was things like deciding we were going to use R and getting sweatshirts. Now we have what I think are I think of them as grown-up problems to have. So these are the ones that are, harder to solve, a little bit less fun, but are serious problems when you get to a more mature and more scaled team. And so going forward for the next 2 years, a lot of the things that we're really focusing on now is thinking about balancing independence with standardization. So the independence thing is really twofold. So from the perspective of moving quickly, we like to have teams that can work independently and kind of do things the way they want to and just move fast. Also, a lot of people on the team come from academic backgrounds, and I think that's really ingrained in kind of who we are and how we think about ourselves. Is no one tells me how to write my code. No one tells me which packages to use. On the other hand, there are a lot of benefits of standardization, both in terms of the packages that you use and the style that you write in, some of the best practices. And so I think trying to find that balance of how much specification and standardization do you need to have. We have a draft style guide, but not everybody follows it. How much do we enforce it? Those are some of the questions that we're tackling right now. One of the biggest questions is how do we find time to devote to infrastructure and balance the opportunity costs? Because we are growing so quickly, every hour that we spend on thinking about planning and infrastructure is an hour that we take away from doing something new and cool and exciting. But as you know, it's not really sustainable to only do those new, cool, exciting things if you don't think about investing and spending down on technical debt. And we actually, a few months ago when I did this survey, I asked, what is the biggest barrier to you for contributing more to our internal package or any of our other infrastructure or coding culture? And the number one answer, it wasn't lack of desire, it wasn't lack of skills or restrictions on the functions, it was time. People want to contribute, we just need to find how to balance the time and how to protect that. So another thing is thinking about versioning and maintenance of an internal R package. So once you have a package, that's great, but then who is the owner of that package? How do you think about maintaining it? And especially when you're thinking about working across multiple teams where the ownership is less clear and not everybody has the same amount of time to devote to it. How do you make that so that's fair and it also is being maintained? And then also I mentioned earlier, a lot of those stickers that I had up were for tidyverse packages. So we love them, they're great, but should we require people to use them? This is a debate I see in code reviews all the time going back and forth. Someone says, oh, well, you should use some tidyverse package here. And someone's like, well, I'd really like to do that in base R. And so they go back and forth. And it's really hard to know how much to just encourage versus to enforce there. And so this next phase of growth, so about 2 months ago, my colleague Katya and I were thinking about this with some other folks on the team, and we said, we are really at a decision point now. We really need to think about what this next phase of growth is and change the strategies for how we figure this out and how we plan about this going forward. So we had a meeting with the team, and we presented the problem and the motivation. So the agenda was we talked about some of these goals that we had then and the goals that we have now and how they're very different and need different solutions and what some of the challenges we face are. And so we did that to kind of get people to acknowledge that there were new challenges that we had to address and to get buy-in, and also to get people excited about what could be the next stages and how to actually be part of that. And so that 2 years from now, if I'm giving a talk again, that they could actually see some of the work that they did as part of the solution there. So we started a new working group, Kati, my colleague, did, and then got started on planning and thinking about where to go from here. And so the first things that this group has done in the last few months is starting off with the first set of goals of defining things like coding standards and best practices. And also, it's not enough to define best practices, but think about how we should hold ourselves accountable to them and if they should be enforced. And one of the first standards that they came up with was thinking about coding readability and kind of a simple guide of writing their code with an audience in mind. One of the things that came up often is that the code that one might write for an analysis is very different than a code a software engineer might write for something in production. And thinking about actually telling the story, laying out the assumptions, thinking about all of the things that go into the analysis as part of how they write the code. And next is thinking about these best practices. How do you actually integrate those into culture? So it's not like you're just telling someone to do something, but it's actually part of something that people want to do. And the last, we're going to get some new stickers because that is really motivating. And so rather than the stickers we had before that everybody got, and I think this idea might have come from the Airbnb data science team or another data science team, I'm sure, of actually only giving them out to people who are contributing certain things and the core group, so to have that kind of motivation. And thinking about there's a lot of challenges around package and environment management that are going to be coming up in the future that we want to tackle. And so just wanted to thank everybody on both the team, the current, past, and future members, and in particular this working group that my colleague Kati just spun up that's thinking about some of these next level grown-up challenges. And also our other collaborators in the R community. And then just a shameless plug that we are still growing. We might double in size again, so please get in touch with me if you're interested in joining. Thank you.